T cells and cell-mediated immunity. So we should be able to explain what antigens are, describe the two main types of lymphocytes, and explain the role of T lymphocytes. So in the last video I did non-specific responses, which include physical barriers and phagocytosis. Just a brief description of what antigens actually are. So antigens are substances found usually on a pathogen's cell surface which trigger an immune response. So they're usually a protein found on the surface of a pathogen that trigger or stimulate an immune response. So this lesson we're going to be looking at the specific responses involving lymphocytes. So there are two types of specific responses. There are cell-mediated responses, which are the T lymphocytes, and there are humoral response, which is the B lymphocytes. And this one, the humoral response, humour is to do with fluid, so the things that are released into the blood, and it's to do with plasma cells and plasma B cells and production of antibodies. However, today, just to go through the two types of lymphocytes, we've done non-specific responses to phagocytosis, but lymphocytes are more specific. They're a bit slower to act, but they do give a much longer-term immunity. So two types of lymphocytes is B lymphocytes or B cells, which is to do with humoral immunity, antibodies and body fluids. And then you've got T lymphocytes or T cells, which is cell-mediated immunity and body cells. So both B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes are formed from stem cells in the bone marrow. However, it's where they mature that they get their name from. So B cells mature in the bone marrow, which is where they get the B bone marrow from, whereas T cells mature in the thymus, so T thymus. So that's where they get the names from. So this lesson we're going to be looking at the T lymphocytes, the cell-mediated response. So the cell-mediated immunity is where, once the phagocytes have ingested or engulfed the pathogen and digested it with hydrolytic enzymes, what the phagocyte will then do is present the antigen of the pathogen on its cell surface membrane as a marker, as if to say, help me, or engulfed a pathogen, please come and help. So they're called antigen presenting cells because they present the antigen of the pathogen on their cell surface membrane in order to kind of flag to the rest of the immune system that there is a pathogen invading. So they're called antigen presenting cells. So the sequence of events that happens in cell-mediated immunity is that T lymphocytes only respond to the antigens attached to the body cell, called cell-mediated immunity. So there are many different types of T cells. The first thing that happens is the pathogen will invade the cell, so it can either invade a cell or it be taken in by a macrophage, also known as either a neutrophil or a phagocyte. And then the phagocyte will then place the antigen from the pathogen on its cell surface membrane. So that's the antigen presenting cell. Then receptors on the helper T cell will bind to these antigens. And that binding will activate other T cells to divide by mitosis. Once they've divided by mitosis to form lots and lots of these T cells, the T cells can then differentiate into either memory T cells or cytotoxic T cells. So the cytotoxic T cells are the killer T cells. So that's what they can do. They can either differentiate into memory T cells or killer T cells or cytotoxic T cells. Or, on the other hand, what they can do is they can stimulate a whole different part of the immune response. They could stimulate the B cells to divide. or they could get the help and come as the help of other phagocytes to engulf the pathogen. So it's basically, it can either form its own killer T cells or memory T cells, or it can get help from the B cells and the phagocytes. And the receptors on each T cell respond to a single antigen, so it's very specific. That's why it's specific response. Now, T cells, the killer T cells, the cytotoxic T cells, work by releasing a substance called perforin. And what perforin does is it perforates or pierces holes in the membrane of the pathogen, which then means that it becomes freely permeable to anything, and therefore it dies because it can't maintain its environment. So killer T cells release perforin, which perforates the membrane of the pathogen, and therefore it basically destroys the pathogen. So on the next video, I'll talk about B lymphocytes and the humoral response.